LMA, it is interview coverage time once again, this time with Subtractum, joined by Captain Lance and Palstron, and of course, game director Jonathan Rogers. We got discussion on unique item reveals, some passive tree changes, and a bit of a rework to the way they're thinking about flasks. There's plenty more in there as well, but as usual, I have picked out the highlights. I've cut out everything that I didn't think was relevant. I'm going to try to get this done in the shortest amount of time possible. So, let's start the clock and get into it. Subtractum opened up asking about WASD and how big of a change that has been, and Jonathan responded, yes, it has been huge and it has been very positively received so far.
Like, we had to be really open-minded, trying to get rid of the idea that click to move and WASD necessarily have to be completely balanced against each other. WASD probably will have a slight advantage. Even since LA, we've been doing more of the work that we need to do to get more skills able to be used while moving. All spellcast animations now allow for movement.
Sub also noted that with his experience of playing WSD, it actually felt like there was quite a lot of buttons to press, and now that we're also pressing the buttons for movement. And Jonathan said that with extra play, with time, your muscle memory should get a bit better and it should get easier, as well as the fact that when you're clearing white mobs and trash mobs, it should be a little bit less demanding, and then you get that spike of intensity and need to use all of your skills, all of your combos when you hit a good rare or a boss. The final new bit of information on this is that they have added key remapping into the game, and so using things like Z, X, and C as an example could be a really good option to get that comfortable with the WASD pressing. From the LA feedback, one of the things that was noted was that earlier in the game, there was 2 high-end item variants of things that would drop. So if you got a really nice rare, it was very easy. If you got nothing, it was brutal. And so what they've done is upped the gold at the start of the game, so that it's a lot easier to fill in those gaps in your build, in your items at the very start. Go to the vendor, buy yourself a couple of nice blues, and you should get a bit of a smoother experience. The final and probably biggest point of feedback during the event in LA was Flask charges. You will have heard this from all of the other videos. Flask charges were a problem. It felt like people were going back to town all the time. So they've changed it.
There's just very little tolerance for having to go back to town in order to recharge your flasks. So we are actually changing the flask system as well. So it's like we could either go more hardcore or we could go more casual. We did decide to walk back to more like how PoE1 is in this regard. Instead, we're going to have it be based on what's called monster effectiveness. What that will mean is that when you're killing like lots of little trash mobs, they might have like a 30% chance to give you a flask charge each, because you can like kill hundreds of them. And when you're fighting big monsters, they might give you like 2 flask charges each. We can effectively have a much better balance control over the amount of flask charge generation.
Palstron followed up talking about flasks, asking, is there going to be automation in the game like we have with instilling orbs in PoE1? And Jonathan said yes, he's absolutely fine with that at endgame. Towards the end of the game, you're going to be able to automate some of your flask tech. He reiterated that the design is still to have a reactive flask system, not the sort of proactive buffs that we're always trying to keep up over in PoE1. Then they started talking about the big release in the ARPG genre recently, Moon Studios' No Rest for the Wicked.
I think that game is what people fear that PoE2 is, in a way. That game is really what you get if you really slow the game down.
Jonathan said generally he's been enjoying the game and he's played it to the end, and he has a couple of pros and cons to share. The pro was that he loved the animation and the weight and the feel of some of the attacks, and that he felt that in PoE2 they're still striving, still trying to push to get that visceral action combat feeling. And then there were 2 cons. The first being that losing control of your character, whether that's due to the incredibly long animation lock-ins on the attacks or because you're constantly running out of stamina, just feels bad. And the second was that losing durability and consumables every time you die was another thing that was quite grating, and definitely is going to be a very different feeling in PoE2, where you can just respawn right outside the boss, go back in and keep trying without any penalty, and I'm thinking without any experience penalty either, especially in the campaign. That has been confirmed. Lance then asked about build making.
Currently, PoE is like this huge sandbox of freedom of whatever you want to do, you can make it happen. And then on the other spectrum, a lot of ARPGs say if you're this class, you get this skill. Is PoE2 going to fall similar, like right where PoE is in terms of freedom, or is they going to try to restrict it?
It is absolutely PoE1's philosophy here.
They're basically saying they just want to show the archetypes so that for new players, they have an idea of what direction to take their build in and what's available to them. He said that even though skills are now tied to weapons, there should actually be just as much, if not more, interesting combinations because of the weapon slot system. Talking about build diversity and having options across the tree, Jonathan actually shared some new information that attribute nodes on the tree, as it stands now, allow you to essentially pick whichever attribute you want. So every time you're picking up a dex or a strength or an int node at the minute in PoE1, you would be able to decide, well, do I want that as a dex, strength, or int accordingly. Palstron then expressed a bit of a community concern, which is if there's going to be these incredibly powerful skill combinations, how are we going to feel like anything else is a viable option, and essentially not feeling like the devs are making builds for us.
Is something that our devs take very seriously. Like anytime we're ever talking about the skill works with that skill, there's always the intention to try and broaden the conditions under which it occurs.
He gave the example of the lightning bolt skill that you shoot lightning arrows into and it arcs between the lightning bolts. He said that essentially any skill that arcs in the game, which includes arc and orb storms and potentially many others, will all interact in that way. So they're trying to broaden these categories as much as possible. Another example you could imagine is the poison cloud explosion that we saw. So firing a poison cloud and then exploding it with some sort of fire skill. Now there's so many fire skills in the game, you can imagine this could be interactable in many ways. This obviously opens up lots of options, not just for weapon swaps and skill combinations, but also for inter-party play, using different skills on different characters and combining them in interesting ways. The group then got on to talking about third-party tools, and Sub asked how much do they want to integrate these third-party tools into the client.
The community will make tools no matter what we do. The idea of somehow stopping that from happening certainly can't happen. So it really comes down to the specific tool, and we can discuss each on a case-by-case basis.
First up, we've got Path of Building, the big one. So Jonathan said it will never be coming to the client, and that is because it allows too easily that you can simulate builds, you can simulate items, and essentially generate items out of thin air. Next up, talking about Awakened PoE, he said that essentially they're running a big experiment with the instant buyout system. They've got their hands full figuring that out, and once they get that working, once it's understood, that they definitely want to look at Awakened PoE, because ultimately everyone uses it. It's going to be another mod that's used in PoE2, and there's no reason that with their integration with the trade side that they couldn't bring that into the game and make the whole experience a little bit smoother. Thank God. They then got talking about target dummies and trying to work out your damage. And as much as Jonathan understands why people want that, he said a much better solution, they think, is that now they have the Elden Ring style damage DPS numbers above a boss's health. You'll be able to actually work out in situation what your DPS output is. And not just that, it's also a much more realistic interpretation of what your damage output is, because it's got real uptime values as opposed to a static uptime that you're just fighting in a hideout. Halstrom then followed up asking about damage tooltips and how they're factoring debuffs and lightning penetration and things like that.
First of all, we're going to be improving the way that we calculate damage for a lot of these things. And then the second thing is that we're going to state our assumptions.
They're essentially going to be approaching this on a skill-by-skill basis and working out the best-case assumptions and explaining those assumptions when you press the alt button.
You've got a skill like Double Slam that hits twice. We showed the hit value for each slam, and then we've got an overarching DPS for both of the slams. And the assumption is you've got a DPS, and we'll say like if hit by both slams.
They briefly touched on the endgame cycle, and essentially Jonathan just said that it's going to be very similar to PoE1. We're going to have maps, we're going to have all of the different content around maps, both in and out of maps in its own dedicated zones, and that will be PoE2's endgame roughly. He said that he did prefer the way that PoE1 had it about 4 years ago, but he couldn't quite explain what it was. It was just something to do with the feeling and what it felt like people expected from the endgame and the difficulty around that. Whether or not he wants to make it harder or easier, I'm not quite sure, and I suppose we'll find out in time. Right, Palston then asked an interesting question about the passive skill tree and what the team are trying to do and what Jonathan's vision is for how they're trying to improve the PoE2 passive tree. Beyond the quite huge news around the fact that you're going to be able to pick the attribute that you're assigning when you pick up an attribute node, he also listed off a ton of other things. Removal of life on the tree because it wasn't really a choice in the first place, less weapon-specific nodes, and more nodes around conditional debuffs and conditions that you can apply to enemies. Keystones will be the same with a big bonus and a big drawback. Cluster jewels are not going to be in there at the start of the game, but Jonathan likes them and he is keen to bring them back at some point, and regular jewels will be in from the start. Laz asked about energy shield and why, if there's no maximum life improvements, why is there energy shield improvements? And he said that essentially it's a much more specialized form of defense, and it is a form of defense on top of your life, and therefore you should be able to specialize in it if you choose to. Furthermore, it was confirmed that Chaos Inoculation is coming back, which is one of my personal favorite keystones, and I love making builds around it, so I'm very excited about that. Relevant to this, there is actually going to be a lot of changes to the ways that Energy Shield and Chaos damage work, both in their conditions and maybe the way that we recharge Energy Shield or stack it, etc. So there's some interesting stuff to come down the line for that. Alright, then Sub asked about casual co-op and how there's currently a bit of a negative synergy where if you're both Ignite characters or you're both cursing an enemy, that you negate each other's curses, or you can only apply one Ignite. And Jonathan said that essentially you just gotta kind of use your brain. Like, yeah, we're not going to allow those things to stack, but you can build lots and lots of interesting things, just like we were discussing earlier with the skill combinations and diversity available there with weapon swaps and the interactions between these things. There's going to be tons and tons of opportunities for characters and casual co-ops, like maybe groups of 2 or 3, just to figure that stuff out as they go, and that it'll become more important as you get to endgame to really hone those synergies down, which makes perfect sense. Then one of the coolest sections that came up in the podcast, which is a real highlight for me personally, and I'm sure probably for you guys, is around uniques. So they managed to sort of tease a little bit of information around uniques out of Jonathan, and he definitely didn't want to spoil too much, but he did tell us about Rat's Nest and Redbeak.
This is an existing unique, so I don't feel too bad about spoiling it, and just how we're changing it. So the Rat's Nest in PoE2 has actual rats that come out of your out of your helmet and fall on the ground, and then the rats like go to corpses and do stuff. Okay. Random other really simple one, right? So Redbeak, like you can see on the sword, like it glows red when you're low in life. It's a minor thing, but it kind of just feels like the stat is something you can see. It isn't just something that like is just there.
They had a long old debate around Magic Find again, and Palstron and Jonathan sort of got into it, and it was interesting. And if that is a special topic of interest to you, then definitely go watch the full video. But here's the TLDR. Magic Find affixes are only going to be available on certain item slots, and so I think that's going to probably be jewelry, so maybe just our rings and our amulet, which are powerful slots in of themselves, so that adds a little bit of that interesting choice element of which affixes to sacrifice, or perhaps a unique slot to sacrifice. And then to sum it all up, Jonathan basically just said that he thinks it's going to be a really delicate balance, that Magic Find does have a place, but that they are going to revisit it as a team, and that after that conversation and conversations that have been happening online, he is open to looking back at it with the team. They're going to arrange a meeting and sort of get back into it, and he said he knows that some members of the team he already knows who on the team likes it and who doesn't, and I'm sure they're going to have a pretty heated, interesting debate about it. Lance then asked about crafting, and the key takeaways here were that white item bases are going to become way more valuable because you essentially can't scour. There's no scour orb in the game, so in order to craft, you can still take an item from a white item up to a god tier item. The chances of not bricking it along the way are going to be a little bit higher, and you can't reverse things as easily, so it's more likely that you're going to need multiple good bases, which he said, is part of their philosophy. They want white bases on the floor to really matter and for you to be hunting for certain bases. And obviously we have that variance as well, so you can get really nicely rolled white bases to use as well. The second interesting thing that I didn't know was that alchemy orbs now always guarantee 4 stats. Now I don't think this is the case in PoE1 unless I'm just an absolute noob and I still don't know that. But in PoE2 for sure, alchemy orbs will take a white item and then give it 4 slots. So that means that you can craft another affix on your crafting bench and then maybe slam a final one to get 6 if you wanted to. Which also means that items that drop with 5 or 6 affixes could be valuable, again leaning into this thing. They want items on the ground to be picked up. We want them to have worth. They then touched on the scope of PoE2, and Jonathan shared his pain, but also his pride on it not being available yet.
I really wanted to get it out last year. That was my sort of real goal, and we didn't manage to succeed at that. So from that perspective, I suppose there's some regret there. But I mean, the product that we will have a crazy amount of stuff going on. So I'm still very happy with that. All the stuff we did felt like that was important to do. If you've got a game like D4 coming out and people immediately saying there's not enough content in it, the bar you have to meet is observably very high. So I guess I don't feel bad about our attempt to meet that bar.
And then we got some miscellaneous stuff, including one of my favorite things, and I'll start with that, which is Ascendancy classes.
Ascendancy classes are your class effectively. Therefore, we need to make sure that all the things on the Ascendancy class are ultra impactful. I would like to try and do more things on Ascendancy classes in general, where like they feel like very fundamentally change how you play. Like how when I was talking about uniques earlier, and the little details that you do to kind of make something feel unique. I think we can do a lot of things like that with Ascendancy classes as well. That is hard to do, but I think can be fun.
I'm absolutely hyped for this. My mind is going a little bit crazy thinking about, like imagine the Beastmaster with certain feline qualities, or a tail, or like cat ears or something, or a Juggernaut that is literally 10% larger character size. Maybe we even get something like that pet dog that we designed into the Brigand Mercenary Ascendancy. Once again, Jonathan was asked about console plans, and they had to ask, but it's still very hush-hush. But he did seem to acknowledge Sub's point that console players currently feel like second-class citizens. We know that is not their intention and that they're trying to fix this for PoE2. Minions are 100% still in the oven, they're still cooking, and we will get them when we get them. Transfigured gems, once again, confirmed they will likely be coming to the game. They've actually already built some, because while they're designing the skills, I'm sure Rory and his team are constantly going, oh, well, if we did it this way, that would be awesome. And they probably, I think Jonathan actually confirmed, they've already sort of worked out the functionality of a few of these when they were deciding between A and B. They are definitely trying to do some fan service, add plenty of Easter eggs from PoE 1 whilst making PoE 2 its own game and not retcon too much. And finally, a note on the quality of life changes. He said that most of the quality of life changes they're seeing in PoE 1 is because those things are already added into PoE 2. That's what inspired them. Discussion they're having about quality of life is really core to PoE 2. And we see that from the passive skill tree, adding shadow points and all of the details, to tool tipping, stealing things from Baldur's Gate, which I've been playing a lot recently, and it is actually a brilliant tooltip system. And then small details like the little numbers above the bosses that they've stolen from Elden Ring as an example. All right, stop the clock. I am done. The interview is complete. That's all of the highlights that I found and everything that I thought was interesting. And I think maybe the announcement of the beta being pushed back has sort of taken the wind out of the sails a little bit of the PoE 2 hype, understandably. I mean, obviously I am fully coped up, so I'm still really enjoying it. But, you know, we also had an Acropolis to play with, and this interview just really, for me, relit that fire. It was another little moment to just get excited, talking about the uniques and the cosmetic changes to Ascendancies, potentially. That would be amazing. That's super exciting. Obviously, we're working on our Ascendancy class design videos still. I've actually got a load that I'm like ready to put out, but I thought, oh, I'll wait a second, you know, whilst we're all enjoying Necropolis. On top of that, we've also got a ton of League theory crafting stuff. I've just finished like an absolute beast of a video. It's like an hour long, so you may want to watch that in like parts, or if you're like me and you're fully coped up, you may want to watch it all in one session if you're into that kind of thing. But it is Incursion 2.0. I'm thinking about how can these leagues, started with Incursion, but we've got Delve, we've got Delirium, we've got the other 30 different league content ideas and mechanics in the game that we can be bringing into PoE 2. We don't know what's confirmed apart from Delirium. Probably Delve, just because Jonathan likes it, and Incursion as well, because he likes it, as he said in the Crip interview. So yeah, we've got all this stuff. We're working on it. The fire has been relit, and yeah, I'm excited to be putting some stuff back out. So thank you very much, friends, Exiles. I'll see you in the next one. Ta-da.